The FTC is running an antitrust trial right now against Meta, and it has almost no news coverage. It's wild. And one of the core things that they've been making the case on is even though Instagram is free, even though WhatsApp is free, because there's no competition, Facebook has made decisions to not invest in the safety of children.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back into the Sanity Podcast. Dave Briggs and Allison Camerata, both of us former Fox News and former CNN anchors. And a reminder, we see things with that perspective in mind from both sides of the aisle. But today we are skipping the politics because arguably nothing is more important, Allison, today than social media and its impact on our kids and, well, frankly, all of us. We're all addicted. 4 billion people worldwide are on social media. 75% of Americans are on social media. Our kids are on social media at least 5 hours a day, and I'm sure yours are no exception.
Yeah, I mean, they've never known a life without it like we did. I mean,
Yeah.
At least we have a memory of what life used to be like without it, but still I'm addicted to it. I mean, when you lose your phone, you freak out because that's your entire lifeline. And I want to figure out a way to get off it because I know that it has a kind of corrosive effect on all of us. But we, as you say, the algorithm, as we've learned, has addicted us all.
We are the product, as they say, and we couldn't be more excited to welcome in today's guest. You remember her as the Facebook whistleblower. Frances Haugen testified before the Congress in 2021, ringing the alarm bell about what's going inside Meta and other platforms like it. She worked at Facebook, she worked at Yelp, she worked at Google. She is a former MBA at Harvard as well, if you need her academic credentials. If you don't remember that historic day on Capitol Hill, he's a little bit of what happened.
I joined Facebook because I think Facebook has the potential to bring out the best in us. But I'm here today because I believe Facebook's products harm children, stoke division, and weaken our democracy. The company's leadership knows how to make Facebook and Instagram safer, but won't make the necessary changes because they have put their astronomical profits before people. Congressional action is needed. They won't solve this crisis without your help.
We are thrilled to welcome in the Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen.
Frances, thank you for joining us. Great to see you. So I think we all remember that day. Take us back, rewind the tape for us. What happened?
It's one of these things where, like, you know, basically all whistleblowers make decisions in the context of you run out of options. Like, whistleblowing is not like a plan B or like a plan C. It's like a plan, like GHIK, way down the line when you're just like, I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know how to live without getting someone else involved. And so I had no idea what the impact was going to be of actually coming forward. Like, I was guided by my lawyers who said, one of the things that happens if you don't take responsibility is, like, sometimes this blows back on people who are completely innocent. Right? Sometimes your anonymity is used to discredit what comes out. Like, all kinds of narratives get spun. Like, taking responsibility is like the adult thing to do. And the couple of weeks after that were a whirlwind. So I don't know if you remember, Saturday Night Live recreated that scene as the cold open that week. So imagine waking up on like Sunday morning or like a Saturday morning and having someone text you and be like, did you notice you were the cold open? Right? Like, you don't want to be the main character on the internet. It's just not the goal. Over the next 2 years, there was like waves of things that happened. So many people in the United States are not aware that the European Union passed something called the Digital Services Act, which gave the European Union, for the first time anywhere in the world, the right to ask for information from these platforms. Lawsuits began to unfurl. So a bunch of former asbestos lawyers started suing the platforms for hurting kids. And we've now reached this point where whole countries are banning social media for kids under the age of 16, like Australia. So it's intriguing to see how the dominoes are starting to tick. And it just takes time for the world to change.
I do want to circle back to some of the legislation, Texas, Florida, the EU, and Australia. You since wrote the book, Power of One. We recommend you all check out Frances's memoir. But first, are we in a better or worse position, though, in terms of the harm being done to our kids than we were 4 years ago?
It's interesting. So my core issue when I came forward was around how Facebook underinvested in the rest of the world. right? So like I brought forward, 20,000 pages that was largely focused on things like ethnic violence in places like countries in Africa or Southeast Asia. And only about 5% was devoted to kids. It was like one of the things we looked at the end, because we assumed as soon as I looked at kids stuff, Facebook would realize I was poking around, maybe not in the core of my job area, right? And the thing that was obvious, even looking through that, say 2,000 pages, 5,000, 2,000 pages, was that Facebook knew there were a lot of really no-brainer ways to keep our kids safe, and they were choosing not to use them. So, for example, should you make the account of a 13-year-old recommendable to an adult on the other side of the world they've never met, right? Like, I don't know. I feel kind of uncomfortable about that as a parent. In the last couple of months, so ever since Australia started to threaten they were going to ban social media, Facebook has started to turn on all these protections for kids that people have asked for 10 years. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, they announced for the first time that you can reset your algorithm on Instagram. I don't think you can do it on Facebook, but you can on Instagram. Go back to day one. Kids' accounts are private now by default until they're, I think, 16 years old. And then at that point, you have to have parental permission to get a public account. There's a bunch of these little things where they finally are doing the no-brainers. But the question is, will they continue to do these things if we let up the pressure? Because our kids deserve to have systems that are safe for them.
And so the fact that Australia is doing it and that it's getting Facebook's attention, what about Congress? What happened after you testified? Did Congress act?
Mm-hmm. So it's you might have noticed our Congress has some challenges passing laws. So every Congress we pass a few less laws than we did the previous Congress. It's wild. So we had a bill called the Kids Online Safety Act that had 60 co-sponsors in the Senate, and it still never went up for a vote.
And why is that? Why?
I would say there's a lot of different angles on it. There's a couple of key senators who got huge amounts of pressure. There are fears about how those laws may be interpreted or used depending on the administration. I think it is an indication of how divided we are as a society, that even issues that seem like no-brainers, like, the number of kids who die each year because of causes that can be linked back to social media, it goes up every single year. It could be buying a fentanyl pill on Snapchat accidentally, right? It could be, kids reporting getting extorted, right? Sextortion is a thing that grows every year. It's one of those awkward topics you have to talk to your 14-year-old boy about, right? But the issue is, like, we have a couple of senators who feel like, if they voted for the bill, that certain lobbying groups would put a lot of pressure on them.
I mean, right. But just so I'm clear, when you say pressure, that some senators were under a lot of pressure, like, we just put a finer point on that, from Facebook, or what lobbying groups would put pressure on them?
So this is one of these fascinating things. When you go look at the ecosystem of people who are having these conversations, there are a handful, like we're talking 5 to 10 groups. This is like Chamber of Progress, who go out there and frame every problem in the worst possible light. And so Chamber of Progress, for context, is a lobbying group that is largely funded by big tech companies. So they'll come out there and say, I'll give you an example. This law would require us to actually keep under 13-year-olds off of these services, which, according to COPPA, which is the Children's Online Privacy Act, which is like 30 years old now, there shouldn't be under 13-year-olds anyhow. But this would actually put more consequences for, like, you need to do something. They say, well, if we were going to do that, we'd have to use IDs, which is just a lie. Like, there's lots of ways to use AI, to use the behavior of kids, to use the fact that most people don't turn off their geolocation. There's, like, if you show up at a middle school every day and you mostly have childlike people for friends, you are probably a child. Just 2 cents. But they'll come in there and say things like, well, we don't want to violate the privacy of these kids. And you're like, well, the ad targeting system is already doing all these things. Like, the net violation of privacy is very, very little. But I've watched them go and lobby, state senators, state legislators, and they make it sound like the world's going to end if you do anything to protect kids.
Since you testified, I can tell you the mental health numbers for teens has gone off a cliff. It wasn't in great shape then, but now 48% of teens, according to Pew Research, say they know social media is bad for their mental health. 55% of parents are concerned that social media is negatively impacting their teens. Is Meta, Facebook, and Instagram doing enough to help to protect kids' mental health?
So this is where I think people should get really angry. So you see people like Mark Zuckerberg going in front of the Senate and making very emphatic statements. We do not have the research to show that social media is bad for kids. And the reason we don't have that research is because the platforms will not help in running that research. They're the only people who actually could run that research because they have access. They could do the real randomized trial. They have all the dose-specific response things of like how many hours per day, what you look at, that kind of thing. If they honestly and earnestly cared about our kids, they could go and in 6 months we could have that data. But the reality is they know something's wrong, right? One of the things that's really shocking, and I encourage, I doubt anyone will go of your listeners, but you never know. I'm always trying to make a plug for it. The FTC is running an antitrust trial right now against Meta, and it has almost no news coverage. It's wild. And one of the core things that they've been making the case on is even though Instagram is free, even though WhatsApp is free, because there's no competition, Facebook has made decisions to not invest in the safety of children. And they've started putting lots and lots of internal Facebook documents freely available out in the public. Like there's literally a Dropbox linked off the FTC's website. And when you look at it, it's crazy. They've known since 2019 at least that, huge numbers of kids were complaining about strangers sending them lewd photos, and they didn't do anything about it, right? It's just like that's the mindset you have to come in there, that they know what to do and they choose not to because they're afraid to scare away parents, scare away kids, scare away average employers.
I mean, in terms of your goal that you expressly set out when you went public of trying to protect kids, trying to stop ethnic violence, trying to stop misinformation, trying to stop the toxicity online. How do you gauge where we are now? Has it, from where I sit, but I'm not the expert.
Oh yeah.
Has it gotten worse since then?
So this is where what's again interesting. It's such a mixed bag for your listeners. I'd love to come back later in the year when this is further down the line because it's going to be like a soap opera this year. It's going to be fabulous. The class action lawsuits of the families that have been harmed, the kids that have been harmed, the school districts that had to put out all these expenses for counselors and tutors and security personnel, the attorney generals, like 44 states have bound together to go after them at the social media companies. What issues do 44 states agree on? Like, just take a pause. Those lawsuits are going to tick off this year. And I've heard that they have millions of documents, like millions and millions of documents. Like I brought out 20, 50 kids' documents. Millions of pages of documents on all those other issues, like reducing the risk of ethnic violence, protecting. Remember, you understand, like a core part of my argument was around how content moderation is basically a lie, right? Like these systems don't work very well. They're kind of a Band-Aid they throw on the end for respectability, and they don't translate them in other languages. So other countries just use like the raw version of these algorithms. That's way worse than it was 4 years ago. When we look at how Facebook used to spend safety dollars, they spent a lot more money on looking into places where Facebook is the internet. And when Elon Musk took over Twitter and showed that you could reduce your headcount by 75%, and no one did anything. Meta came out and fired tens of thousands of employees, including huge swaths of their safety teams. So we are making progress on kids. Like I genuinely am excited that maybe we can turn back those horrible numbers because they're going to keep getting worse if we don't do something. But we do need to continue to remember we live in an interconnected world, and destabilizing South America, countries in Africa, that's a huge, huge problem.
One thing Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO and founder of Facebook, would tell you is, well, we've unrolled out Instagram Teens. 2 different research groups just did a deep dive on Instagram Teens. Here's what they found. 28 Instagram reels described sexual acts, including digital penetration using a sex toy, and memes describing oral sex, and became preoccupied with toxic masculinity discussions about what men should and shouldn't do. Another group made up of primarily Gen Z users found it recommended sexual content, body image, and eating disorder video, such as a video of a woman saying skinny is a lifestyle, not a phase. Instagram teens, was that just for show, or did it accomplish anything?
One of the big challenges that Instagram is always trading off is, you were talking about before, like, we are the product, the algorithm addicts us. There's this trade-off, which is, let's say you do go and make kids' accounts more private. Then there is less content going around the system, right? There's less. The content is the fuel that runs the machine. Let's say you go in there and you start to actually watch for these things. You start saying, hey, I noticed you're looking at more depressing content. Like, one of the really tragic cases I learned about just this week was this 14-year-old boy broke up with his girlfriend, was searching Instagram about breakup stuff, also was searching for things like affirmational quotes, trying to make himself feel better. And once the algorithm knew that he had just gotten broken up with, a lot of people who have a breakup then look at more negative content for a period of time. And it started showing him stuff about why killing himself would just make things better. And so it's one of these things where, if they were to acknowledge that these algorithms can amplify, can push people in directions that they don't want to go. He was looking for affirmational content.
But Frances,
sorry, go ahead.
Why? I'm a capitalist. Yep. I'm all for everyone making as much money as they possibly can. Why is it good for the bottom line to push negative and harmful content?
So I would say that what the issue is, like, imagine a world where they acknowledged there's some dangerous content. Like, let's say you start looking at more and more depressing content because you just had this breakup. Imagine they popped up a thing saying, hey, we noticed you're looking at more depressing content. It's kind of like what it was like around seatbelts in the 1960s. Right? People were afraid to put seatbelts in, even though they had really good data, because they were worried that if they were the first mover on safety, people would ask, why are you doing this? Are your cars more dangerous than others? And right now, that's a trend across all of the platforms. Like, none of them want to be the one to acknowledge that the algorithms could be dangerous, because, maybe that would make, if you drew attention to it, then parents would be like, oh, maybe this isn't a safe place. And that's my theory on it.
Wow. That is really sobering. I mean, I guess the good news is that over the arc of history, seatbelts do come into play and people do add airbags, but you have to wait a long time for that. And so on a more personal level, when you see what Mark Zuckerberg and the other, tech giants are doing in terms of, I would say, kowtowing to President Trump and going and kissing the ring and all that stuff, what were your thoughts?
Well, this is, again, one of these things where it may not be obvious to people who aren't, closely watching FTC trials. So, having a reasonable lives, which is, this is the year of kind of consequences, right? So a number of different pieces started getting set up, even as far back as the first Trump administration, because you're totally right. These things move very slowly. And this is the year when, Google lost an antitrust judgment just maybe a month or two ago. Meta's up for potentially being broken up right now. It's been very thoroughly reported that Mark is hoping that if whatever he can do to curry favor with Trump would allow him to potentially, either shortcut that at the end, have Trump slow it down. Fortunately, it seems the Justice Department, the FTC is actually continuing to prosecute this case. But it's clear that they're hoping they can, avoid the consequences that have been catching up with them.
A lot has changed with Mark Zuckerberg since you left the company and since you testified, including the chains, and now he's jacked up and talks about toxic masculinity and all that. But also, the curls, the big ass curls, but also a very important and underrated process that goes on his platforms. And here was how he justified that.
First, we're going to get rid of fact checkers and replace them with community notes similar to X, starting in the US. After Trump first got elected in 2016, the legacy media wrote nonstop about how misinformation was a threat to democracy. We tried in good faith to address those concerns without becoming the arbiters of truth. But the fact-checkers have just been too politically biased and have destroyed more trust than they've created, especially in the US. So over the next couple of months, we're going to phase in a more comprehensive community notes system. Second, we're going to simplify our content policies and get rid of a bunch of restrictions on topics like immigration and gender that are just out of touch with mainstream discourse.
There is a lot to unpack there. I
Yeah.
always struggle with the notion that fact checkers are political, but why
Really?
do you think he did away with fact checking? What was the impact?
So, those are two actually very different sub questions. So, why did he get rid of it? He got rid of it very clearly because it was a major source of heat, especially from people on the right side of the political spectrum in the United States. What's the impact of it? So, one of the core things that I brought out in the Facebook files was that the fact checking program was. I don't want to go so. I was trying to speak very carefully. I wouldn't say it was a lie because they did pay journalists to write some of these fact checks. But, globally, they were doing hundreds of fact checks a month and there were billions of pieces of content, right? It's one of these questions of it was much more about respectability. They wanted to never have Pope endorses Donald Trump be the most important story on the platform right now. And so it was really about just pulling off a couple of pieces of content a day that were the most viral. So in one way, it's good because Community Notes does scale better. The only problem with Community Notes is, again, we're falling kind of back at the last step in the process, right? So the real problem is, what are the algorithms biased towards? Because right now the algorithms are biased towards extreme ideas. How do you approach that? Or information operations. This is where foreign agents come in and weaponize our social media. They're a huge part about why certain kinds of mis and disinfo go the most viral. What are they doing to hunt those groups? So I think it's good that we're not using third-party fact checking as like a panacea anymore, but we do deserve a right to see, for example, every piece of content that gets more than 1 million views. We should have a right to see that. We should have a right to know what's being invested in stopping those foreign agents.
Francis, you still know a lot about this. Why are you still so plugged in? And do you use social media?
So I have a goal for this year to start using social media again because, like I said before, the FTC documents are just like off the hook. People, one or two people have pinged me about them, and I then went and checked, and there was no reporting on them. There's still no reporting on a bunch of them. For example, 20% of all the messages, those remember people getting lewd messages, there was no policy against that in 2019. And 20% of all those messages that were reported were from children who received them from strangers, right? You would think that would be a news story. So I'm going to try to start using it this year. That's the goal. I can give you my handles if you want to follow me. But the reason I'm so plugged in is social media hasn't changed that much in 4 years. It sounds kind of wild, given that we think of it as this dynamic thing. But the underlying architecture is pretty similar. We're still evaluating success with a small number of metrics that are business oriented. We still don't have access to even minimal oversight or transparency. And we need to have a framework where consumers, where the market can actually compete, where people can see these two networks are meaningfully different. I might choose to use one over the other. And all of that is still true.
And speaking of multiple networks, a lot of focus and attention has gone towards TikTok in recent years because of the massive growth on that platform. A lot of talk about a TikTok ban, which President Trump continues to kick down the road, seeking a U.S. buyer. Would you be concerned if your kids were on TikTok? Is it a national security threat? Should we let our kids be on it?
Yeah. So I think there's some really giant open neurological questions about TikTok. So I don't know about you, but I have at various points in the last 5 years gone through periods of time where I was maybe more stressed than other times. And I've realized if I watch Netflix instead of watching YouTube, so that's 45 minutes, hour-long piece of content versus 5-minute piece of content, 10-minute piece of content, I feel less stressed. When you talk to kids and they talk about watching these little half-minute, minute-long videos, you end up with kids that are really, really wound up. In China, you're only allowed to do that for 40 minutes a day if you're under the age of 18. And yet kids are spending something like 3.5 hours a day on social media. So I think the first question is like, I caution parents to let their kids use it alone or without controls, like set reasonable limits. That's the bare minimum. But the larger question is, what are your kids getting exposed to? So just so people are aware, whistleblowers have come forward saying 2 to 3% of all the content on TikTok is heated, right? TikTok chooses what to send viral. And I think part of why the divestment bill, the ban bill, got pushed through last year was it happened almost perfectly aligned with the Gaza protests on college campuses. And I'm not going to take a side. I'm not going to wade in that conflict pro or con because it's very messy. I'm not an expert in the Middle East. But the fact that the right and the left all got on board immediately and passed a bill in like, what, a week? I think means that probably there was some influence from TikTok around what got distributed and what didn't get distributed. So it's complicated.
Allison has 3 teenagers. I have 3 teenagers. And when I talk to them, they see these pieces of legislation. Texas, I mentioned, is a minor limit. Florida is 14. The EU is a minor limit. And Australia is definitely the most comprehensive. But what my kids tell me is, we're smarter than that. We're way ahead of that. We know exactly how to avoid all that. They're way ahead of these bans, aren't they?
So that's where I think it's so fascinating to listen to how kids talk about them versus like if you actually knew how these systems were built. So, for example, one of the things that got announced by Instagram just a couple of weeks ago was that they were going to start using the content that kids post to find underage users. Because remember, as of 2022, something like 30% of 7 to 9-year-olds said they were on social media. So this is one of these things where if the 9-year-olds know not to ever post a picture themselves, then they can avoid that one, right? But then it's this question of like, who are you friends with? How fast do you type, right? Like I watched an interview with a 10-year-old who was very prolific on not Minecraft, Roblox. He made Roblox video games. And the reporter asked him, is there anything you don't like about Roblox? And he said, I hate it when creepy adults message me. And I was like taken aback in that moment because like, isn't everyone like a cartoon in Roblox? Like I'm old, so I don't really know all the details, but I'm pretty sure they're all cartoons. And the journalist clearly was shocked too. And she goes, how do you know they're creepy adults? And this 10-year-old goes, they type so fast, right? So there's all these things where we bleed data into these systems. They already use it to target you with ads. They could take down the under 13-year-olds anytime they wanted to. So that's why I'm like, if we actually had legal consequences, you can keep kids.
And it's important to say none of these kids enter their actual birth date into social media platforms. To my knowledge, none. I know my kids did not, and I was probably part of that problem. So
for us, you've given us so much good stuff already and suggestions, but are there 2 or 3 things that right now for listeners, for parents, for any listeners, you would suggest we do right now?
So it's interesting. I got asked a question just like a day or 2 ago in a similar interview where they were talking about, this isn't going to be true for every parent, but there's parents that are living with kids who really have an intense relationship with social media, where if you try to take their phone away, they get fights, the kids are struggling to sleep at night, that kind of thing. So I think one of the things that I'm encouraging people to look into, and this is true for even adults, is there are apps now. I think the one I was thinking of is called 1 second, where it just puts a wall between you and any app you want, where when you want to open that app, it pops up and it makes you wait for 30 seconds. And it tells you how many times you open that app that day, right? So, you just have to take a little breathe, it reminds you to breathe. And little tiny things like that can help us step away from a compulsive relationship with social media into a more intentional one. And so that's one thing I'm encouraging parents to say, like, hey, like you don't have to be binary. Like I'm really pro social media. Like social media can be really good for kids. It's just right now it's not designed to be. And we have to, in some ways, find ways to kind of fight for a little more safety and health. But the second thing is you need to understand how many minutes, how many hours a week your kid actually uses these things and when. because you may not be aware if you're letting them sleep with their phone in their bedroom. Should not let kids sleep with their phones in their bedroom. How late at night kids are online. So those are the two big ones that I like to pass on to parents.
Yeah, I often see my kids falling asleep with videos rolling next to their head, which I obviously we all know is horrible for your sleep. One positive trend that I believe is positive, I want to get your thoughts on school cell phone bans. The two biggest
Ooh,
districts in the country, LA and New York City, are on board. How positive is that development?
So I want
Or negative. I shouldn't frame it that way.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'm always trying to remind people on, because I think this is one of the things where, like, there's a famous quote from Gibson, who's a sci-fi author. The future has already arrived. It is just not evenly distributed. And when you look at it, even as far back as last year, you started seeing the most prestigious private schools in the world banning cell phones. So Eton, which is a very posh, private school in the boarding school in the EU, or in the UK. I think Phillips Exeter, Andover, a couple of those other big ones in the East Coast, they're banning cell phones. Like, one of the amenities you get for sending your kid to a boarding school that costs $60,000 a year is they learn to connect with kids in person. And I think there's a real thing of, we need to ask the question of, do we want to live in a world where the rich have kids who occupy spaces where they are forced to learn to interact with people? Or do you want to live in a world where, you go into every average high school, and this is true today, and at lunchtime, the lunchroom is quiet now, and kids are just on their phones. And that's the thing we're asking to trade off.
I really miss the food fights of my youth.
You never participated.
Man.
You never participated. Yeah, you're too old. Yeah.
I was a professional flirt.
Oh,
man.
I feel like
I know you're not surprised at me. But I do, it does bum me out that I don't think my kids know how to talk to girls, and part of it is that phone. Part of it is not.
Can I tell you
a job interview at some point, right?
Can I tell you a story? So I'm at the University of British Columbia, and this woman interviewed me for a student panel or a student event thing, and she's a professor, and she's like a neuroscience person she studies attraction and arousal, right? And we had been giving this lecture at Stanford where she primarily teaches, and she was just on sabbatical, and she goes, it's amazing, like this kid walked up to me after a lecture, and he goes, it's so interesting listening to you speak. There's this girl in my dorm, and we have a Facebook group for the whole dorm, and like she posts these really cool, funny things. I've like left comments for her, and we share one lecture. She sat near me like a week or two ago, and she came up. I went up to her and started talking to her, and I started sweating, and my heart started beating quickly, and I started feeling really anxious, and I left because I was worried I was having a panic attack. But listening to you, I think I might like her.
Oh no.
And that's what happens when we don't coexist as physical people, is like we lose touch with our own bodies. It's like, so, it breaks my heart.
Me too.
Yeah.
I mean, you shouldn't have to wonder if you're having a medical crisis.
Yeah, that's an unfamiliar feeling. I hate to break up. We're taking a lot of your time, but I do want to ask you about one far more serious to break up the good vibe we have going. Sorry. We had Josh Koskoff on this program a couple of weeks ago. He is an attorney who was the first attorney ever to successfully sue the gun companies he won against the oldest and biggest gun company. You know of Josh. He also took down Alex Jones and InfoWars. He is a friend and a neighbor of ours. He said one of the biggest problems going on Meta in particular leads to more gun violence and school shooting.
Yeah, and knife violence.
You've seen the research, though.
Yeah.
How big a problem was that then? Or to your knowledge,
how does it do that? How does it do that? How does it lead to more gun violence?
Is it marketing to kids as well?
I think there probably are ads that are mistargeted that end up with kids. I think the issue is, like, when we look at interviews with kids, and they talk about stuff like violence, like exposure to violence. Kids talk about how, like, or quite extreme sexuality. Kids say, I didn't look for it. It just came into my feed. And it's one of these things where, if you have someone who might be more vulnerable to expressing their frustration or their anger in a physical way, and the algorithm picks up on, oh, you lingered longer when I showed you this gun thing, it can end up being a thing where you start to see just more of it in your feed. And we have to be honest, like there is a lot of content either in the UK around knives or like Adolescence, the Netflix show, is based on the fact there is a growing amount of knife violence. And it's because there's lots of videos that fetishize people holding big knives and you solve your problem with knives. And so I would say the larger safety issue in schools, though, is that there's like a lot of events that take place in schools now that are instigated by social media. So this is things like a kid pushes another kid down the stairs so they can film it and put the kid online. Right? That is the thing that happens. Or, a kid posts something that offends another kid, and because they're, already emotionally wound up because they had their phone, they couldn't use their phone all day, they then lead to a fist fight, right? So there is an escalating amount of violence. That's part of why the schools are suing, because they're like, we have to spend more on security today than we used to. And it's probably going to keep getting worse until something is done about it.
To forward this problem, and if this is out of your lane, I apologize. Artificial intelligence, how much worse would this make the problem?
If you ever want me to come back, like we can have a talk about AI friends. You can feel real old. We can feel real old together.
Girlfriends.
Talk about sexual partners.
Sure. So here's the interesting thing about AI relationships. So one, Mark Zuckerberg came out just a couple weeks ago, like maybe a week, 2 weeks ago, and was like, the average American only has 3 friends. And, their desire for friends, they want more friends than that. And AI can fill that gap, which I find hilarious because, the AI could also just coach you to getting more actual friends, right? It doesn't have to be the thing that you're now attached to. But what we see with kids is the number one creator of these things before Meta kind of pushed them out into the world for us was called Character.ai. It's still out there. And last year they were bragging that their average user was using them for 2 hours a day, which means like their 90th percentile user is talking to their AI friend for 4 hours a day, right? And the majority of their users were under the age of 18. And I think the thing we need to be really concerned about is an AI friend can be very alluring because they only talk about what you want to talk about. And they only need you when you need them, right? They if you want to go do something else, they're not going to feel offended that you didn't talk to them for a day or two. Whatever vibe you want, they're going to provide. And the thing is, becoming someone who can relate to other humans is hard. Like you have to make a lot of bad flirts to become a great flirt, right? And it's one of the and so it's I think it's one of these things where all of these systems should be required to report things like when they survey their users, how many users say this helps me connect with other people in real life, like helps me better connect. Because if you have a platform that is just optimized around minutes you spend with it per day, it will be geared unintentionally to keep you there all day and not have other friends. So
such a good point.
With the context that Gretchen Rubin of the Happiness Project just told us, the number one most important thing with happiness is, of course, personal relationships and friendships.
For sure.
The number one thing that's probably getting broken down.
Are we ready for just a minute?
Yes,
Frances, we ask all of our guests at the end for their dose of sanity, how you keep, in particular, because you know so much about this, your head from exploding every day. What do you do to maintain your sanity?
So I feel really fortunate that while I have an undergraduate engineering degree, I went to this college called Olin College of Engineering in Needham, Massachusetts, where you also used to have a minor in the humanities. And I minored in Cold War studies because the period of the Cold War was amazing in that the impossible just kept happening over and over again. Like apartheid ended, or like the British left India, or like we ended like the worst of like Jim Crow in the United States, like things that were impossible. The Soviet Union ended. Like things that were truly impossible to end ended. And so for me, like the thing that gives me my dose of sanity is remembering that when we feel like we are living in the end times, I personally believe that's like an act of vanity, right? Like to say like, oh, no, but this time it's so bad. This time there's no hope because it says that we can't do anything. And I would rather, there's a lot of research on how when we believe that a solution can be found, we are much more likely to find a solution. And so I choose to take it as like an act of faith that we will figure something out. At some point, the consequences will get high enough that we will be willing to act. And I will do my best to help guide us towards the least harmful, most constructive way forward, the best. So that's how I
That's
keep
beautiful.
saying.
That's really inspiring. I like that.
That was terrific.
Yeah.
Frances Haugen will forever be the Facebook whistleblower. She's the author of The Power of One. We really enjoyed this conversation and would love to have you back to talk about AI, its impacts, AI
More
girlfriends,
flirting
AI.
and
Yeah.
more lunchroom.
Yeah.
All of it.
Yeah.
How can we have teenagers flirt more? That's a national priority.
Yes, that's our goal. Yes, that's great. Frances, thank you very much. This was
Been a
really
pleasure.
enlightening.
Happy to see you. Have a great day.